In the middle of the 19th century, before automobiles, skyscrapers, interstate highways, and shopping malls, an ordinary citizen, Fredrick Law Olmsted, had a vision for America's cities.
We want a ground to which people may easily go after their day's work is done, and where they may stroll for an hour, seeing, hearing, feeling nothing of the bustle and jar of the streets, where they shall, in effect, find the city put far away from them.
Throughout his career, Olmsted designed over 500 nourishing green spaces in all corners of the country.
Olmsted, he's one of the towering figures in the history of American cities, the history of American landscape.
He was the forefront of the anti-sprawl movement.
There would be no national parks without Olmsted, state parks without Olmsted's vision. I mean, he was there in the beginning.
The Olmsted legacy shaped this nation.
He was effectively creating palace grounds for common people.
The guy who works 6 days a week in the factory, brings his family here, stands on this hillside and says, "This is our estate."
In the middle of the 19th century, public parks did not exist in American cities. While wealthy citizens retreated to their country estates, poor city dwellers had no escape. New York City was unhealthy. Crammed into overcrowded tenements, people lived on top of each other in squalor. Sanitation and waste methods were primitive. The stench was intolerable. Disease widespread. The grid plan, established and carried out by the city fathers in 1811, which gave the island of Manhattan its leveled and democratizing numbered map, allotted almost no room for open green space. Visionaries in New York understood that the city would continue to grow rapidly and eventually run out of space.
New York City wasn't developed very much above 23rd Street. It was kind of teetering on being a great city, but not a great city. And the city leaders realized that what do we need in New York to make us compete with the great cities of the world? And two things that really popped out. One was you needed fresh drinking water, and then two, you needed a great park.
The man who would build this park, transforming the 19th century American city irrevocably, was Fredrick Law Olmsted. Early one morning in 1831, 9-year-old Fredrick Law Olmsted left his home in Hartford, Connecticut with his little brother John to visit his cousin's cottage in Cheshire, 16 miles away. The boys, unaccompanied, walked for 2 days through the rural Connecticut countryside. Olmsted was fearless and at home in the wilderness.
The happiest recollections of my early life are the walks and rides I had with my father in the woods and fields. Sometimes these were quite extended, and really tours in search of the picturesque. Thus, before I was 12 years old, I had been driven over the most charming roads of the Connecticut Valley, through the White Hills and along most of the New England coast, from the Kennebec to the Naugatuck.
Olmsted would later devote his life to bringing this natural joy to the masses of America. Born in Hartford, Connecticut in 1822, Olmsted at an early age was introduced to the hardships of a 19th century existence.
My mother died while I was so young that I have but a tradition of memory rather than the faintest recollection of her. I remember playing on the grass and looking up at her while she sat sewing under a tree.
Olmsted was 4, his brother John 1 when their mother died. His father, John Olmsted, a prosperous dry goods merchant, remarried shortly thereafter and had 4 more children.
The children of the first marriage were somehow a little bit left out. Olmsted was already, I think, 5 or 6 years old. There were these new children. All the attention was paid on them.
Olmsted and his brother John became close and adventurous friends. With their house as full as it was, Olmsted's father elected to send Olmsted away to receive his education at a series of boarding homes. Nature became the one constant that Olmsted could turn to throughout his tumultuous childhood, and he quickly developed a fierce independence.
He wasn't a natural student. He was the kind of person who learns more from experience and from looking at things than from books. This all adds up essentially to a kind of difficult childhood and to some extent, I think, a solitary childhood too.
When 14, I was laid up by an extremely virulent sumac poisoning. I was troubled for several years with a disorder of the eyes, and the oculists advised that I should be kept from study.
It was expected that Olmsted would continue his education at Yale, but in light of his condition, he turned instead to a young life of work and the outdoors.
Olmsted was both, I think, psychologically and mentally uninterested in higher education.
At the time my schoolmates were entering college, I was nominally the pupil of a topographical engineer, but really, for the most part, given over to a decently restrained vagabond life, generally pursued under the guise of an angler, a fowler, or a dabbler on the shallowest shores of the deep sea of natural sciences.
Got a job through his father in an importing house in New York City, did that for a year, went to sea as a merchant seaman for a year.
At the age of 21, Olmsted took a year-long formative trip to China as a deckhand on a merchant ship. Conditions on the ship were grisly. Olmsted nearly died of malnourishment and spent a mere 4 days off the ship in China. Here, he came to identify with the life of the common man. On December 10, 1843, he wrote his brother John from aboard the Ronaldson, bound for the East.
My dear brother, I suffered most severely from seasickness, but I never wished myself clear of the ship. Even in the time of greatest danger, when the captain expected the bark to go down in 5 minutes and that old topsail that we'd just got reefed down close was a cracking away. Oh, Jack, the old sea is glorious, sublime after all. Dear brother Jack, God bless you. I'm crying like a baby. Your loving brother Fred, all the world over.
The man came from a range of background experiences that were very human, very approachable, and shaped his ability to think both at a grand scale and for the common man.
Back home in Connecticut, Olmsted felt pulled toward the land of his childhood.
Rural tastes at length led me to make myself a farmer. I had several years of training on widely separated farms, then bought a small farm for myself.
22-year-old Olmsted studied the art of the gentleman farmer and enrolled in Yale as a special student, studying science alongside his brother and friends. He began reading the agricultural journals of Andrew Jackson Downing, who would give landscape new meaning to Olmsted.
Andrew Jackson Downing was the leading landscape gardener and writer about landscape design in the 1840s.
He'd sort of raised public taste in the broadest sense, in gardens, in architecture, and interior decor.
Olmsted read Downing's journal, The Horticulturist, and actually began to contribute articles to that journal. So Olmsted was aware of Downing as a person who said that aesthetics, and especially the aesthetics of gardening and of landscape, were a crucial element of creating civilization.
Downing showed Olmsted that a new America could be made, one where cities and towns could be planned to include public parks, where greenery could uplift even the poorest citizens. It was at his Newburgh estate that Downing first introduced Olmsted to his architectural assistant, the young Englishman Calvert Vaux, who would soon play an invaluable role in Olmsted's career. With Downing's encouragement, Olmsted, at 28, took a walking tour of Europe with his brother John. They lived on pennies a day and saw for the first time the democratic urban parks of Europe, in particular, Liverpool's Birkenhead Park.
Olmsted and his friends were amazed that the people of Birkenhead themselves had created this. It was not something that was given to them by a prince or a king.
Here was a park that was used by many people, working people as well as middle-class people, and they were all kind of mixed together.
This was the sort of institution that they thought the American Republic should be providing for itself.
In democratic America, there was nothing to be thought of as comparable with this people's garden.
He was also impressed with the overall coherence of the design, the way that the walks and the drives moved through the landscape, the way that different kinds of experiences were achieved in different parts of the park. And all of those were elements that were in his mind when he started to design Central Park a number of years later.
Shortly after his return, Olmsted chronicled this trip to Europe, publishing Walks and Talks of an American Farmer in England. It was the first of many successful published works. Ever more enticed by the promise of literary success, Olmsted sold his farm and, having established himself as a roving correspondent, went to tackle the southern United States.
As a journalist, he traveled throughout the United States on this long tour of the South, sending weekly reports to the New York Times, a brand new New York Times. So he got very good at going into a situation, as a journalist does, and sort of understanding it very quickly.
After traveling the plains of Texas and the bayous of Louisiana, under the pseudonym Yeoman, the former vagabond farmer found he had developed a literary reputation in New York. Word of his success quickly spread.
Olmsted had an important standing in what they call the literary republic of New York, the literary world. And also he had served for a couple of years as the editor of Putnam's Monthly Magazine, a journal of opinion, of politics, of literature, and had published the writings, significant writings of a number of leading American writers, including first publication of articles and short stories, both by Melville and Thoreau.
It was due to his new esteem and also to chance that Olmsted was led to the job that would become the most important of his career. The city fathers had set aside land in the center of Manhattan for a new park so that rivaling neighborhoods from the east and west could appreciate it equally. The site for the park was a large plot of swampy, rocky land occupied mostly by squatters.
It was just at that time that the new commissioners were looking for a superintendent of the parks.
The obvious choice to bring New York's Central Park to life would have been Andrew Jackson Downing.
Downing also called for the creation of a great park in New York City worthy of that city and of the city that it was to become.
Tragedy struck, however, when a steamship accident took Downing's life in 1853.
It's one of those questions of history. What if he hadn't died? Would Olmsted have come up? You know, wouldn't Downing have just overshadowed him and gotten all the big jobs? Wouldn't they just have hired Downing to do Central Park? I suspect so. So would Olmsted ever have had the opportunity to blossom? Perhaps not.
Never the slightest thought, till I was more than 30 years old, had entered my mind of practicing landscape gardening, except as any fairly well-to-do working farmer may.
Olmsted spent a great deal of time in the London parks. He had seen the new parks of Paris under construction. He had seen parks in a number of the other cities throughout Europe, Italy and Germany in particular.
Olmsted believed in Downing's idea of a great park for New York City. Tapping into the knowledge he gained as a journalist and gentleman farmer, he began avidly lobbying to become the superintendent of Central Park.
There was a group of very influential people that Olmsted could turn to for signatures to support his candidacy for the superintendency of Central Park in the fall of 1857. In fact, it is said that the signature of Washington Irving was what got him that job. That, combined with the signatures of a number of other significant and important and influential people in New York City, was enough to get him a position of landscape and construction, not of literature.
After a very long session and much debate, I am elected. On the final vote, 8 of those present voting for me, 1 against me. The strongest objection to me? That I am a literary man, not active. Yet if I had not been a literary man so far, I certainly should not have stood a chance.
Olmsted was named superintendent of Central Park on September 11, 1857. He was 35 years old. 2 months into his new job, news came that his brother and dear friend, John, was fatally ill with tuberculosis. On November 17th, Olmsted received a final letter from his brother.
Dear, dear Fred, it appears we are not to see one another anymore. I have not many days, the doctor says. I never have known a better friendship than ours has been, and there can't be greater happiness than to think of that. Don't let Mary suffer while you are alive. God bless you. John.
John Hull Olmsted left behind his wife Mary and 3 children, John Charles, Charlotte, and Owen. A deep grief settled upon Olmsted. Again, he turned to nature to find solace, but this time his focus was on making it accessible to others.
Just at the time that Olmsted is becoming superintendent of Central Park, superintendent of a park that really at this point does not have a design. He's simply in charge of preparing the site and will then presumably be in charge of construction once the design is chosen.
As talk increased about who would design the park, A.J. Downing's former architectural partner Calvert Vaux campaigned to see his late partner's dream realized.
Egbert Ville, who was an engineer, had been hired to design the park, and Vaux looked at Ville's plan and decided it was a disgrace, and a disgrace to the memory of Downing. So Vaux undertook the political games necessary to have Ville's plan derailed. He arranged for there to be a public competition.
So he approaches Olmsted, who has just become the new superintendent, and says, look, you understand the park, you're there all the time, your local knowledge will be crucially important for the creation of a design. If the two of us join together, we can have a fine design. And